what can we expect in the rest of the paragraphs? In the rest of the paragraphs, the author is going to be developing that thesis, right? That giving engenders ambivalent feelings. Now, think about it. Why would the author divide the remaining of his argument into separate paragraphs? In other words, why isn't the text just about just a whole big blob, one single paragraph? Think about it. The reason is that this argument needs to be persuasive. So the author wants to persuade us of his thesis, of his argument. How will we get persuaded? Well, we would like to see different sides to this argument, right? So the reason why we have in a text a number of paragraphs is exactly because this is the author then would use different arguments, to all of which will build towards the development of his thesis. So for example, if we have a text about a certain biological discovery, right? The author has the choice of how to develop their argument that, for example, that discovery is going to have very big consequences, ramifications in the field of biology. So it's a very important new central study. So the author may decide. So in the first paragraph, and remember, each paragraph is its own whole. So in the first paragraph, usually the author introduces the topic, a few introductory sentences, and so on. And then usually in the second part of the first paragraph, then we will have the thesis. What is the main argument that the author makes, okay? And so now the author will decide how to develop this argument. So as we said, so for example, we can have a first paragraph in which the author, again, if we have the thesis about some very new important discovery in biology, in the first paragraph, the author may decide, for example, to give us the background to these studies, right? And then there could be a paragraph in which the author discusses an alternative study that had opposite results, right? So for example, counter argument. And then in the next paragraph, discuss the study itself, and so on. The idea is that you have to look at each of these paragraphs as a whole on its own, and then all of them develop the thesis. And each paragraph has a main idea of its own. Where can you find this main idea? Usually it will be in the first sentence. So each paragraph also has its own main idea. Ideally, by the end of reading the text, let's give it one more paragraph here, and at the end maybe final suggestions, questions for further study, and so on. So when you finish reading a text, you should be able to, of course you don't have time to do this, but this is the idea, you should be able to, in a sentence in your head, to say, okay, this is a text in which the author argues this. This is the thesis, that this is a new fundamental study. In the first paragraph, the author's idea is this, and the author does this and this. In the second paragraph, the author gives us a counter argument in which he argues this and this. And then the author further describes, and so on. So in one sentence, you should be able to say the topic and each of the main ideas of each paragraph, subsequent paragraphs. Why is this important? This is very important because it will allow you to stay on top of the text. For example, Imagine that let's say in this paragraph, imagine that somewhere in the middle of the paragraph, you have a very complicated sentence. A complicated sentence with a lot of unfamiliar words. Like 3-4 lines, and you get totally lost in that sentence. You have to remind yourself, okay, I don't understand what this sentence means, but I know that this paragraph is about this. This is the main idea of the paragraph. And I know that this sentence is an example of this counter argument, of this main idea. And this is enough for you. This is enough, so you don't have to understand every single sentence. Because if you focus on one sentence and you zoom in, you might get lost and confused. But oftentimes that's not even necessary to understand certain words, unless then you have a question specifically on that sentence, and then you will deal with this. So let me repeat this. You do not need to understand every single word. You do not need to understand every single sentence. You do not need to read each sentence super carefully. On the contrary, you should be reading smartly. You should be reading constantly. So not just reading for content, what the text is saying, but also reading, figuring out as you read, is this a main idea? Is this just examples and secondary stuff? And whenever you have a main idea, you have to underline it. Why do you have to underline it? Because then when you look back into the text, it will be much easier for you to see the structure, the skeleton. And of course, you want to underline maybe names of scientists and circle maybe some terminology. And if there's some year mentioned or something like this. So those things can also be underlined, but most important is to underline the main ideas. Okay, and again, the main ideas give you the skeleton, and then once you know what the text is about and what each paragraph is about, you will not get lost in the details and maybe some difficult words or a difficult idea and so on. So let's go back to our text. So now that we have figured out the main idea of our text, we want to then see how the author is developing the argument, the main argument that we saw in the first paragraph, okay? So as you can see, we have maybe 3-4 more paragraphs, so let's see what the author is doing. So you remember that here the thesis was that giving creates ambivalent or contradictory feelings in givers. So this is the second paragraph here. So immediately you size it up. This happens with practice just to see how big it is. And as a matter of fact, I do recommend before you read the text to very, very quickly, just for 5 seconds, just quickly glance at all, just to see how many paragraphs it is, how long it is, because this gives you, again, it prepares you psychologically, and again, gives you a certain sense of control, that you know what's going on with the text, okay? So, second paragraph, let's see what's happening. Anthropologists, now I would immediately underline this, anthropologists, because we get a certain person's point of view. So we don't have a particular name, but we have a type of person. So I would underline it, because as you'll see later, then we have economists. So I don't get confused between who is saying what, okay? So anthropologists describe giving as a positive social process. Economists, however, again, pay attention to linking words they introduce an opposite point of view. Economists, however, offer a less favorable view. So I would be underlining these things because, so we have, according to anthropologists, giving is positive. According to economists, giving is not positive. According to Wald Fogel, gift giving represents an objective waste of resources. Okay, people buy gifts that recipients would not choose to buy on their own, or at least not spend as much money to per a phenomenon referred to. Now, every time there is something like a terminology, in this case it's not a terminology, it's a phenomenon, but if it's in brackets, it's some kind of a term, the dead weight loss of Christmas, and the SAT likes to have questions on such terms, so I would definitely pay attention and underline. To wit, givers are likely to spend $100 to purchase a gift that the receivers would spend only $80 to buy themselves. So, according to economists, gift giving is a waste of resources because actually the recipient usually wouldn't spend so much money on the same gift. So if you're buying me a t-shirt for $30, I would have only spent like $20 on a similar t-shirt. Like I would not have spent this $30. So this dead weight loss suggests that, this gives me an indication, this verb gives me an indication that now we're going to have an argument, some kind of a statement, so that's important. Suggests that gift givers are not very good at predicting what gifts others will appreciate. Now this seems like the main argument for this particular paragraph, right? So as you can see, it doesn't come at the beginning because the beginning is kind of building up to it. But the main argument here is gift givers are not good at predicting. And actually the example comes before that. So often you have the statement and then the example, but in this case the author decided to do it this way for persuasive reasons. So we have the example that they are not good at predicting is exactly because here we have that this evidence from this person that what people would buy, recipients would only spend 80% on the same thing. And then that in itself is not surprising to social psychologists. Now I have another group of people. Be careful. So we have anthropologists, economists, social psychologists. So this is not surprising to social psychologists. So social psychologists agree with economists, right? Research has found that people often struggle to take account to others' perspectives. Their insights are subject to egocentrism, social projection, and multiple attribution errors. So this is kind of in relation, but the main argument is here, right? Because it's about the gift giving and it relates to our thesis.